Hello students, I hope you all are safe and sound at your houses. Let me introduce myself. My name is Anurag Chaudhary and I am going to teach you English. Let me tell you about your syllabus first. You have 2 books in this year in your literature segment. These 2 books are Honeydew and It So Happened. Honeydew is the main course book and It So Happened is a supplementary book. In the book Honeydew, the first chapter is the best Christmas present in the world. And today I am going to teach you that chapter. So the best Christmas present in the world is written by Michael Morpurgo. Michael Morpurgo is a famous author, especially he is known for writing children's books. You may have heard about this book called War Horse that has been written by him, and even Steven Spielberg has made a movie on that book. You may watch the movie. Obviously you are free during this lockdown, a lot of free time you have got in your hands, so you definitely will get some time to watch the movie. So the book, The Best Christmas Present in the World, was published in the year 2004. And it, just like the book called War Horse, is based in the context of the First World War. It deals with the devastation the war had caused, and very specifically a special incident that happened in the year 1914. 1914 is the first year of the First World War that continued for more than 4 years till 1918. Now you obviously know that the First World War was a kind of war of such magnitude that people of the world had never seen before. Scores of countries got involved. Millions of people got affected. Many of them died. And this war was fought for what? For the political gains of certain people who called themselves leaders. But what impact did the war have on common people and on common soldiers? So this story gives us a glimpse of that war. A war that was so devastating and of such magnitude that could not be thought of before. So let us get back to the story itself. So as I was saying, the story tells us about a special incident, a special event that took place in the year 1914. Actually, as I told you, leaders, they generally have to get political gains, and that's why they make common people fight against each other. But do soldiers really wish to fight? They are common people like you and I. They also wish to live. They also wish to be loved. They also wish to live a long life. They don't just really wish to die. The romanticism that you get to see in movies is not actually experienced in real life. So during the First World War, the soldiers had enough of this fighting, enough of this killing each other. So what they did? They called a truce. What's a truce? A truce is a ceasefire. When soldiers from opposing parties come to an agreement to stop fighting for a certain period of time. So in the year 1914, soldiers from different countries, be it Britain, be it France, be it Russia, Germany, Austria, what they did? They stopped fighting and they enjoyed Christmas together. British soldiers were fighting against German soldiers, but they stopped fighting and they started enjoying the Christmas together. And this story tells us about that incident. I'm going to show you obviously a clipping of that event, but before that, let me tell you more about the story. So the story opens with the narrator telling us about his desire to buy a roll-top desk. What's a roll-top desk? Just look at the picture. A roll-top desk is often or mostly made of wood. It's a kind of desk with a hollow space in the middle with 2 rows of drawers on 2 sides. And there's a platform on the top on which you can write, you can do work, etc. So he had always wanted to buy a roll-top desk, but roll-top desks were very expensive. So what he did? So he was somehow came upon an old one, an old piece of junk. That's what is said. So he came upon an old roll-top desk that was being sold at a junk shop where old furniture and other things are sold. So he saw an old roll-top desk being sold at a junk shop. It was most probably made in the early 19th century. If the story is written in the year around 2000, so of course the roll-top desk was more than 150 years old. It was made of oak and it had got scorch marks and water damage on it. Scorch mark means most probably the roll-top desk had caught fire and water was used to extinguish the fire. So as a result, both water and fire had their toll on the roll-top desk. And that's why the roll-top desk was being sold at a very little price. So our narrator bought it for a little price and he thought of repairing it and using it. He brought it home and started working on it. So while he was working on the roll-top desk, he noticed that one of the drawers was stuck fast. Means it was not opening. So what he would do? So he used brute force, means he hit the roll-top desk like an animal. And when he hit so hard, the drawer flung open. And it revealed a shallow space underneath. Means there was a secret chamber. And what was there in that chamber? He found a black tin box. So just imagine you buy an old piece of furniture, bring it home, and then you find a secret chamber in it, and there in the secret chamber you find a box. So what does the box hold? Does it hold some treasure? Maybe. So our narrator was excited. He brought out that box. But what was there in the box? On the top of the box, a piece of paper was pasted. And it was written on the piece of paper that Jim's last letter received January 25, 1915. Focus on the word Jim's last letter. So of course the letter was written by a person called Jim and it was his last letter. Means he had never written any more letter after that. Most probably he died after writing that letter. So Jim's last letter that was received in the year 1915. That means around 85 years ago. So our narrator got curious and he opened the box. He found a letter inside the box. The letter was written by a man called Jim McPherson to his wife, Mrs. Jim McPherson. Mrs. Jim McPherson's name was Connie. And this letter tells us about that truce I was talking about, that ceasefire I was talking about. When soldiers stopped fighting in the middle of war and made peace and enjoyed Christmas together. One day means on the day of the Christmas, suddenly it was also different. In the morning, somebody waved a white flag from the German trench and wished Happy Christmas to the British soldiers. Now, they also exchanged greetings. But then somebody from the German side came out waving a white piece of cloth. But British soldiers did not immediately respond. They thought most probably it was a trap, so that British soldiers would come out and the German soldiers would shoot them. Jim McPherson, he was a captain in the British Army, so he was a platoon commander kind of. So he asked his soldiers not to respond, not to go out of the trench. But he was wrong. The Germans were not trying to trick them. They were actually willing to have a truce. So they came out in large numbers and requested the British soldiers not to shoot. And then 1 or 2 British soldiers also got up, and then there was no stopping. British soldiers and German soldiers gathered in the no man's land. What is a no man's land? A no man's land actually is a portion between 2 opposing armies where no people step into. This much of empty space is kept so that soldiers from opposing armies can have a safe distance. It's a kind of agreement they come to. So there in the no man's land, they gathered they gathered and they just started exchanging greetings. They exchanged their drinks, their food, their sausages, etc. Now Jim McPherson was still very doubtful about getting mixed up with these German soldiers. However, still he came out and met a German soldier called Hans Wolff. Hans Wolff introduced himself and told Jim McPherson that he was a cello player in the orchestra. Cello is a musical instrument. It looks like a violin, but it's large in size. You see the picture, you will understand that. So he said that he was a cello player and he was from Dusseldorf in Germany. Now Hans Wolff introduced himself. Then Jim McPherson told him that he was from Dorset, England, and he was a school teacher. Now before I move ahead, let me tell you about one thing. Just focus in the 2 facts that Hans Wolff was a cello player, that means a musician whose job was to entertain people. And Jim McPherson was a school teacher whose job was to teach students, teach them to love each other, teach them not to fight. Now these 2 people from 2 creative fields had come here to fight against each other and to kill each other. That's the irony here. A school teacher who teaches his students not to fight, a musician who spreads love through his music, had to kill each other, had to fight against each other. Why they were fighting? Because their leaders wanted them to. And that's the irony of the story. Now Hans Wolff and Jim McPherson exchanged words. Hans Wolff told Jim McPherson that he had learned about England and he had learned English from his school books. And he also had read Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was his favorite author, and he had read a book called Far from the Madding Crowd that was written by Thomas Hardy, and it was his favorite book. So in the middle of war, they stopped fighting and they were talking about different characters from the book. Then they noticed that somebody had brought out a football, and German soldiers and British soldiers, they started playing a football match. When? In the middle of this. So they piled up grey coats and khaki coats and as goalposts, and then they started playing. Now grey coats means German uniform and khaki coats means British uniform. Now one thing you need to remember, the Germans were called or nicknamed, German soldiers were nicknamed to be Fritz and British soldiers were nicknamed to be Tommies. So Fritz and Tommies, they started playing a football match. And during this football match, Hans Wolf and Jim McPherson were conversing. Now they suggested to each other that wars could easily be avoided. How wars were fought because of some conflicts. Now these conflicts could easily be resolved by playing football matches or cricket matches. By playing games, they could resolve issues. Why they were fighting? Fighting would not make any party gain anything, because both the parties would lose a lot. There would be a lot of damage on both the sides. Even after that, they were fighting. So they agreed upon the fact that conflicts could easily be resolved by playing games. See how similar their ideas were, how similar their desires were. Hans Wolf from the German side and Jim McPherson from the British side, they had the same idea in their minds. They had the same desire to stop fighting and go back to their families. But they still had to fight. In the meantime, the football match was played. The Germans won against the British 2-1. However, Hans Wolf said that the British goal was wider, that's why it was easy for German soldiers to make goals. So obviously, he was easing down the kind of heat of the moment. Then, of course, after exchanging greetings, exchanging food, exchanging drinks, exchanging sausages, and playing a football match, they returned to their trenches. Excuse me. At night, the Germans started to sing a Christmas carol in German language called Still Nacht. Listen to the music a bit. And the British soldiers also sang a Christmas carol called While Shepherds Watched. And that's how the day ended. Jim McPherson had written about this incident in the letter. And that letter was received by Connie. Jim expected that he would soon return home. He also had talked about the marzipan cake his wife had sent to him, the marzipan he had shared with Hans Wolf, etc. And he expected to return home soon. But we know that he had never returned. He had died at the battlefield. Now I am going to show you a footage. It's not actually a footage, it's a clipping from a movie that depicts the events of that day. You just watch that video footage, then I am going to continue the last segment of the chapter.
Nein.
Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, all is calm, all is bright. Nur das traute hochheilige Paar, holy infant, so happy and love, sleep in hellish peace.
Ein Blitzer kommt! Ein Blitzer kommt!
Jim?
Jim, don't do it!
Halt! Er ist nicht bewaffnet! Nein, Otto!
My name is Jim.
Mein Name ist Otto.
Pleased to meet you, Otto.
Freut mich.
Rose, she's called.
Schön. Ist schön. Danke.
Happy Christmas.
Frohe Weihnachten.
So in the last segment of the story, the last part of the story, we get to see that the narrator is willing to return the letter to its rightful owner, that is Mrs. Connie Macpherson. The way the letter was preserved, we easily understand that it was of utmost importance to her. So our narrator wishes to return it to her. From the letter itself, he had got Mrs. Connie Macpherson's address. It was 12 Copper Beaches, Bridport, Dorset. So he started for the place. He found out Mrs. Connie Macpherson's house, but it was abandoned. He found out it to be a burned out shell. The windows were boarded up. The roof was gaping. From a neighbor, he learned that Mrs. Connie Macpherson was a lovely old lady. She was a bit muddle-headed, means she was not so stable. However, it was a very common thing to happen at her age. She was actually a 101-year-old lady. Now she was admitted at a nursing home called Burlington House that was on the other side of the town on Dorchester Road. So our narrator went there. He told the officials that he was a relative, a well-wisher who had come to give a present to Mrs. Connie Macpherson. Now the officials, the nurse, the matron over there, they also were happy to see him because nobody had ever come to meet Mrs. Connie Macpherson. So they took him to Mrs. Connie Macpherson. She was there among those wicker chairs. Wicker chairs means beter chair. So she was there in a room, and there among those wicker chairs, she was seated alone. The nursing home was decorated with paper chains, Christmas trees, because it was Christmas again. And other patients were together. They were somehow feeling the vibe of Christmas, but Mrs. Connie Macpherson was all alone. Now our narrator approached her and handed her over the letter he had brought. He told her about the context in which he had found the letter. But Mrs. Connie Macpherson was not even noticing that. She was looking at him continuously, incessantly. She stroked the letter as if it was such a dear thing to her. And she then spoke. She looked at our narrator's face and said that she was very happy to see Jim again. In her muddle-headed condition, she mistook our narrator to be her past husband, Jim Macpherson. She said, "So Jim, you returned. So you promised me that you would return. And finally you have. And that too at the Christmas." And then she said that Jim's return from the war, obviously Jim had not returned. She mistook the narrator to be her husband Jim. However, she considered this return of her husband Jim to be the best Christmas present in the world. She said that she had already prepared marzipan for Jim and together they would enjoy that because she knew how much Jim loved marzipan. And that's how the story ends. Now, focus on the term the best Christmas present in the world. What's the best Christmas present in the world? Not only Mrs. Connie MacPherson's feelings towards Jim and realization that Jim has returned from the war. Obviously, he had not returned. She mistook our narrator to be her husband. But this return of her husband was taken by her to be the best Christmas present in the world. But that is not the only present that has been talked about here in the story. The greetings, exchanges of good words, playing a football match in the middle of war, that is also the best Christmas present in the world for the soldiers. So for the soldiers, it was also a kind of the best Christmas present in the world because they managed to forget the devastation of the war and they came together and celebrated Christmas together. What else could they wish for in the middle of war? When they were fighting against each other, they were killing each other, they were taking lives, or they were getting killed. In the middle of all that chaos, they enjoyed Christmas for one day. So of course, it was the best Christmas present in the world for them because they managed to enjoy Christmas for one day. Fighting was stopped for one day. Killings were stopped for one day. And they enjoyed Christmas. That's why that celebration was the best Christmas present in the world for them. That's the end of the lesson. Your job is to go through the entire chapter word by word. Try to understand what is written. And in this lesson, I just gave you a summary of the lesson and tried to explain important parts from the story. It is now your job to read the story in detail and try to understand what is being said. Try to acquire whatever information is being presented. And then I will provide you questions and answers from this chapter. I will ask you questions to be answered. Thank you.